All right, thanks everyone for joining. Boy, I see lots of names that I know, so this is very nice. I'm seeing some of my friends I just made in California like 2 weeks ago, so good to see you guys. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend about 45 to 50 minutes. We're going to wind up talking about testing. Uh, Thanks for joining us. I was worried that the subject and the title would turn people off and we wouldn't get a nice turnout, but this has ended up being very, very nice. Uh, First slide is here's my contact information, uh, phone number, email address, and if you have any questions afterwards and you don't want to do them during the chat, just call me or send me an email later. We also have a newsletter that goes out twice a month, and it's just a one-page thing. It's usually information that we've collected from teachers in our travels that seems like it would be worth sharing with other folks. So since you registered, you will be on that. If you don't want to get it, you can tell me two ways. You can just say, Mike, don't put me on that one, or you can try one, and if you don't like it, you can just unsubscribe to it once you've gotten it. So we'll do the newsletter, and you contact Jason for copies of the PowerPoint we can get. I think he's already got it posted, and contact Jason about some of the other projects we're working with too, as far as I'm excited about the combination of live and webinar workshops that we're now putting together. Our first contracted one will begin in this upcoming school year in Brooklyn. So we're excited by that. Okay, so let's get started. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what I want. I want testing. I want to go through a year and end that school year and not feel data dizzy. I'd much rather think about the data we've collected on students through our testing program and have a feeling of being data driven. And that over my 23 years of being in a classroom, being in a school district, that didn't happen. Most of the time we got our test results back. There was this general angst for about 2 months. And then I pretty much caught myself doing pretty much what I had been doing the year before. So I think we could get more from our testing programs, and that's what this is about. This has been a tough year for testing. We've got, the truth is, in too many schools, we have too many standardized tests. Some of that is a state problem, but it compounds itself by what we do. So there'll be one state test in Florida, in California. But then what school districts will do is we'll add 2 or 3 other big tests to prepare for the test. So some of the problem is us. It's not all coming from the state. So we shouldn't be surprised as we begin to talk about evaluating teachers and evaluating students and school systems using a test. Well, what would happen? We'd create more tests to prepare for the test. So this past year in Ohio, I added up the tests we had, and it was all of these. We had the Ohio Achievement Test, the Ohio Graduation Test, the Iowa Assessments, Measures of Academic Progress, MAP. We had Dynamic Indicators of Early Literacy, which are DIBELS. We seem to be doing DIBELS. I think we did DIBELS every 15 minutes in my building. And then we have end of quarter benchmark testing, and we have end of course tests. We have college entrance tests, and then all of those practice for the test. So think of all the time we're doing and all of the big tests we give. So here's been the issue. Tests are evil, and the people who defend them are trying to hurt children in schools. But the other side of this has been tests are the only reliable information we have about students because we can't trust anything coming out of the school systems themselves. We need objective data. That's kind of where this argument has been between one of those two camps. We did this. The real question that gets lost in this big debate is this. We need to ask ourselves, what data do we need to improve teaching, leadership, and learning in our schools? So let's always start the debate from there. So first of all, I'm not saying that we should throw big tests out of schools. There are lots of things that they do very well. Usually we call them summative assessments, and they're given periodically to check if learning's occurred. They help us answer the big question, which is at the end of the year or the end of the quarter, Did our students master the skills that we taught? They can also answer other questions. For example, if a student scores in the 75th percentile in 6th grade and then the 86th percentile in 7th grade on the Iowas, we can see that the child's gaining ground relative to grade level peers. Big tests answer questions for politicians and parents and pundits about whether they're getting their money and their value from the school. How do my kids in this school compare to kids in other schools across the state or across the country or sometimes around the world? And big tests now like the Iowa or our state achievement tests are also used now to evaluate the effectiveness of curriculums and our textbooks. Now we even use them to, we're looking at using them to evaluate the effectiveness of teachers. But we shouldn't have tunnel vision, and this is where the problems come in. We do a lot of testing, but it's always big tests. And the theme for today's workshop is going to be, maybe it's time to get a better balance of testing. Test big tests and combination of little tests. And it's been out of whack in that we're doing too much big testing. Let's think of these big tests as the test at the end, and think of them as exit tickets. Now, formative assessment, which came into rage maybe 10 years ago, those are those smaller assessments, and let's think of those as tests at the beginning. Let's think of formative assessment as entry tickets. Now, standardized tests are telling us what students don't know, and smaller tests could tell us why they don't know it and what to do about it. That's when we'd be balanced. Another way to say this is, think about standardized tests can prove whether learning occurred, where smaller classroom formative assessments could actually improve the learning that's about to occur. So one proves learning, the other one improves learning. So here's a little test. The instructional decisions with the greatest impact on student achievement are made by teachers not once a year when standardized test results roll in, but every few days. Designed classroom assessments could be an integral part of the assessment process when incorporated into classroom practice. They provide specific, personalized, and timely information about student misconceptions, student interests, and teachers' misassumptions around specific skills. So let's look at little tests. How about, I can read your answers to this, so let's do a question. What is formative assessment? A few folks, let's post your definition of what formative assessment is. What's formative assessment? Post it and we can all read them. All right, so these are great. I'm seeing a quick check for understanding. Betty says that it's the assessment that has the ability to drive instruction as it's occurring. Jim says that it's, wait, I lost Jim's. You guys are going too fast for me now. Okay, Jim says, check what the student already knows. Nice. Lisa says, assessment that drives instructions, questions that students might have. So let's do this. Formative assessment, the point of it is it's small. We do it while we're teaching, and we do it as a check. So with that said, when would formative assessment be most helpful? After 4 days of instruction or 2? What's your answer? Formative assessment after 4 days or 2? All right, so let's do this. Most people, what we've seen posted is, yeah, the consensus is that doing formative assessment after 2 days is probably more productive than doing it after 4. And the reason for that is going to be, I want to catch misconceptions of mine or misassumptions of mine or misconceptions from the students in smaller blocks so I can catch those mistakes earlier before we have spent more time, and then I've got to reteach lots of things. So catching a mistake from the student side or my side after 2 days is probably better than going 4 days and realizing that they've missed some of the prerequisites for where we're at now. So 2 days is better than 4. Well, then it brings us to the next question then. Well, then what would be better, 2 days or 1 day? Using that same logic, what's better? Well, 1 day, catching mistakes when they're really, really small before we waste any more time instruction in day 2, in day 3, and day 4. So now here's the question we really need to ask then. How about no days? How about no days? Yes, Barbara, you were right. How about no days? Wouldn't it be better to catch student misconceptions and teacher misassumptions after 2 days? 1 day? Well, then it would be even better not to waste any time teaching the wrong lesson in the first place. Now, this is the essence of formative assessment when we move it in front of the instruction. Now, this would be formative assessment, but it's also called a pretest. And just like lots of us are talking about using exit tickets at the end of the lesson, at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, exit tickets. Now let's switch and let's have a balance between those. But now let's begin to think of testing as an entry ticket. Now this entry ticket isn't to sort kids, but it's not to prove whether learning occurred. This entry ticket is to improve the lesson I'm about to give, because the pretest will allow me to know who my audience is and adjust the lesson accordingly. So pretest, the most effective classroom or formative assessments measure students' skills and interests before instruction begins. They help me design the lesson that students need. And there's no wasted days. There's no wasted instructional time. Bob Marzano used to do formative pretest all the time with his classes when he was a teacher. Now, the way he would do it was this. Friday, at the end of a week's lesson, he would sit with his students and spend about 10 minutes and ask questions. He would want to find out. He would do it like this. You know, class, next week we're gonna spend a week talking about Pearl Harbor. Why don't you guys tell me what do you know about Pearl Harbor? And he'd have them answer that question, and he'd find out what they knew, but he was also finding out what they didn't know. So if a student raises his hand and shouts out that Pearl Harbor occurred in Missouri, well then Bob Marzano would know he had to include a geography piece with the lesson he was about to give. He would also ask not only what do you know and what you don't know, but he would also ask, what do you want to know about a lesson? These are the 3 questions he would ask. What do you know? What do you want to know? What don't you know? And what do you want to know? And he would then design his lesson over the weekend. He would fix his lesson over the weekend so that this information was included. The difference is we're just going to write it down. So here's the deal. Pretests should not be painful to build or take. One of the problems we run into is that as soon as we say test, people think 40 questions. People think about sending it in somewhere to be scored on a Scantron machine. No, we're talking really, really small. Now remember, Bob Marzano used to do this in 10 minutes and it was conversational. We're trying to keep the essence of the pretest like that. So pretests shouldn't be painful to build, take, or score. Good pretests only have a handful of items and take about 15 minutes to administer at most. And the purpose is to gather information about a student's readiness to learn the skills or the lesson that I'm about to teach. Pretests will uncover student misconceptions and, more importantly, teacher misassumptions. You score them, but you don't grade the pretest. Your purpose isn't to grade or sort students, but to determine their level of readiness for the lesson you're about to give. Now, here's the deal. Whenever I talked with teachers about doing pretests, here's the response I'll get. Pretest? I've never heard of something so stupid. Testing students before I even teach the lesson is a waste of time. We haven't even covered that material yet. Of course, they're not going to get any of the answers right. They'll get a 0. This is crazy, and I'm wasting my time, and I'm using up good formative assessments on this test. Well, yeah, you are, except that's not the kind of pretest I'm talking about. Let's see the difference between my pretest. When you talk about pretesting to improve instruction or pretesting to determine where your students are, you are not going to do the same sort of formative assessment or end of lesson test and just drop it in the beginning. It's very, very different. So let's look at what this 5-item pretest, what it would be broken down into. Question 1 and question 2 could be grade level questions based on the standard. Question 3 could be a bit easier question based on the 3rd grade. Let's say it's a 3rd grade test. Questions 1, 2, and 3 are all going to be 3rd grade questions. But now look at the money questions are down here. Questions 4 and question 5. Question 4 is going to be based on a prerequisite skill a year below grade level. Question 5 could even be easier than that. It could be based on a prerequisite skill 2 years below grade level. You know you're doing the wrong kind of pretest if all your students score 0, because then all you've learned is what they don't know. Our purpose is to find out what they do know and where they are at in order to help me decide where my lesson needs to start. So the real money questions on a good pretest are, in this case, questions 4 and questions 5. I'm checking to see if my kids have the prerequisite skills to access my grade 3 lesson. And know what the fact is? Most of the time when our lesson isn't successful, it's because kids don't have the prerequisite skills. So we'll spend a week teaching weather station to a group of high school students and wonder why the lesson never works. Well, it never works because they don't have a prerequisite skill that we assumed they did, which is they don't even know longitude and latitude. And we just assumed that they did. Well, a pretest would have sensitized you to the fact that you had to go back and teach some of those prerequisite skills. Now your lesson will be successful. Bob Marzano has a great line. Bob Marzano says on Monday morning, you should walk into your classroom knowing that you have a lesson that is appropriate for 85% of the kids that are in your room. 85%. Well, that means knowing my audience. Think about, Jason and I were talking about this, how different this presentation would have been if we knew we had a group of parents. If we knew we had a group of students, it would be a different PowerPoint. We knew our audience first. We looked at the registration, looked at who was coming online, and this is the presentation, primarily a teacher one. So we knew our audience. So let's look at this. You can build, now people say, how will I build this pretest and how can I get these below grade level items? Well, actually, for reading, it's simple. If you're building a pretest around reading standard 3.2, the prerequisite skill is standard 2.2. That's how they've created the Common Core. They line up perfectly. So 3.2, the prerequisite skill is 2.2. The prerequisite skill to that would be 1.2. So that's the way they line up. Now, the problem is with the Common Core in math, that lineup doesn't work. So 2.2 might be a very, very different skill than 3.2. It may not be the prerequisite. So one of the resources that we've been using are from Battelle for Kids. What they've done is they've done the vertical progression guide, and it's a flip book. I think it costs like, well, $24. It's a flip book that will take you from a standard from grades K all the way through grade 12. And then you can say, okay, if I'm teaching standard 4.2, I'll grab a couple practice questions for there. And can I also, I'll go down to the standard below it and grab a couple practice questions from there. But the numbers don't line up, so you have to use, I wind up using the flip chart from Battelle. I think it's a great resource, and it's really, really inexpensive. So give it a look. Okay, let's see how it works. Let's play a game. So let me tell you about a story about a teacher named Amanda. Here's what I would like to see us doing during the course of a school year. Now watch how she'll use both tests, her big test, but then how she'll also use the big test and then filter that down and balance that with a smaller test. Watch what she does. So here's her big test results. This happens to be an Iowa report, but it could be a state report. Now take a look at her report, one page, and this is reading. Can you see what she did? What were her strengths and weaknesses? So what was her strength in the reading? Can you tell me? What was her strength? Write down so I can see that I'm always afraid you guys have turned it off already. What was a strength for Amanda's class? Subtest in reading. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Annie. Yeah, we just look here. Now, know what else I want to point out? Watch what we're able to do from how quickly we can get started with data-driven instruction. We are going to look at two pages of a report. Now think how many times we get handed these huge binders of test reports, and we spend months going through this data, trying to figure out what it is we were supposed to do, because that is the purpose of a big test. The purpose of a big test is to change the behavior of the adults in the building. But sometimes we spend too much time looking at the data instead of doing something about the data. So watch what Amanda was able to do with two reports. So Amanda can do this. She can look at this first report and see that key ideas, which is a subtest of the Iowa and also a strand in the reading for the Common Core, her students did great on that. So the message to Amanda is, keep doing what it is you were doing, okay? Now, what about weaknesses, bad news? You can see both of them, explicit meaning and author's craft, okay? That's bad news. Now, what the purpose of the big test from my idea is that big tests can provide a sense of mission to Amanda. Amanda's mission for this school year is to change her behavior, change her lessons in those two areas, the areas of explicit meaning and author's craft, because those were weaknesses. That's her bad news. The big test is great at this. So she'll look there, she picks those two strands. So Amanda's success stories were apparent. The clear winner was key ideas with a 71%, correct, higher than the national norm. And she can drill down into key ideas and see what those standards are that make up that strand. And she sees that her students were able to identify central ideas and support their stories. So she makes a note that she remembers to use these strengths whenever she attacks weaker skills. Now, what about her mission? Amanda's honest bad news are also evident. There are two areas that stand out, author's craft and explicit meaning, with correct percentages of about 43. Now watch what she'll do next. She's going to use her class item report, and she's going to follow the arrow. She's going to say, what was author's craft? What does that even mean? And what the Iowa tells her, these are the items, and these are the skills that make up author's craft. Well, you can also, if you look at the Common Core, author's craft is made up of 3 reading standards, 4, 5, and 6. So to define that strand, she can look at those 3 standards that make that up. And she can say, I have to change my lessons when I'm teaching these particular skills. This is where my bad news was. And so she'll do this. This would be a pretest she could build. She's a third grade teacher. This was standard 5 she was working on. Analyze the structure of the test. That's one of the standards that's in author's craft. She wants to build a pretest. She will build it like this. Look what the third grade standard says. It says kids will use text features such as keywords, sidebars, hyperlinks to locate information. But now look at the prerequisite skills. The second grade standard says use captions and subheadings. It's easier. The first grade standard is have students use glossaries, tables of contents to find information. Her pretest is going to cover all 3 of those standards because she wants to find the base. Where are her kids? And you can bet that many of those third grade students are actually stuck down at first and second grade. She's going to discover that and adjust her lesson. That's the change she's going to make. So her pretest might look like something like this. Sorry, fourth grade test. It might look like this. Now look at the difference in the items. They're getting easier because she's got a couple grade level items on there and she's got some prerequisite skills, which are lower grade level items on there. Let's do another one. Let's do 8th grade. This is 8th grade, and we think this is going to be one of the reports that we'll get from our state testing with PARC or Smarter Balance. This is an 8th grade test, and again, take a look at it and tell me where bad news. This is an 8th grade teacher, Ken Tankerus. Tell me what his bad news is, his mission that he's going to develop from his big test. What's the mission? Which domain, which strand is his lowest? Are we seeing number sense? Where 37% are below on number systems? So yeah, so again, what does Ken do? Ken looks at his big test and he doesn't say, oh, I need to do better in math, because look at some of the areas he's doing fine in this. Look at geometry. He doesn't need to fix his geometry lessons, or certainly not fix them first. So Ken's notion of he got his results back from his big test. He doesn't run around like a chicken saying, I need to fix math. He doesn't need to fix math. But what he does need to do is rethink some of his number system lessons, because look at the score. 37% of his students were below. But that's a manageable fix. Now I don't feel data dizzy, I feel data driven from the big test. It's told me where my weakest strand is. I will attack that. That will be my mission. That's what a big test can do. And what will I do? What are number systems for 8th grade? Take a look. It's 2 standards. That's it. There are 2 standards. So what Ken is going to do is take a look and say, when do I teach these? And before I do, I better check that my students have the right prerequisite skills, that I'm not making some misassumptions about what they know and don't know. And I'm even going to ask them what kinds of things they want to know so that I can improve my lessons. I'm not just going to willy-nilly make changes to my lessons. I'm going to I'm going to make data-driven changes to my lesson based on the information I collect about my students through the pretest. So it's drilling down. We use the big test and then we go to the smaller one. So it's 1, 2, 3. We have a test, math. We have a topic, number systems. And inside number systems are those 2 standards. Teachers live at the standard level. That's what you're doing next week. That's what you're doing next month. The pretest will reflect those standards. Pretests can help us engage and develop engaging lessons too. because we don't only ask students what they know and what they don't know. Remember, Bob Marzano also asked his students what did they want to know about Pearl Harbor. Let's do a test. Everyone is agreeing that engaging students is important. So if you are going to spend a week teaching middle school kids, 8th graders, a lesson on Pearl Harbor, what do 8th graders want to know about Pearl Harbor? Why don't you answer that question? What do 8th graders want to know about Pearl Harbor? What will you include to make your lesson engaging? Okay, guys, let's stop. And know what? If you look at your answer, so we've got things like, what year did it? So remember, the question was, we're going to spend a week doing a lesson on Pearl Harbor with 8th grade students. How might we keep them engaged? And I asked you to put on your thinking hat and think about what would be engaging to students. So I've got answers like, well, what was the conflict about? Where did it happen? What was the significance about it? When we actually asked 8th graders, their answer was, their question, what they wanted us to include in the lesson was ninjas. Ninjas. Now, I think all of us, when I asked us to list what we thought would be engaging to students, in many ways, we witnessed the whole theme of today's workshop, which is we were a grade above where our kids actually what they wanted to do. The number one response we got were our students wanted us to include ninjas. And so guess what? We honored their request by looking at our lesson and seeing where we could put ninja-like things into the lesson. And since we honored their interests, guess what happened? They honored our lesson and they paid attention, and the behavior was better, the work was better because we listened to what they said. My point is that it's often hard to figure out and to guess what's engaging to 1st graders, to 5th graders, to 12th graders. Well, why are we guessing when we could simply ask? But when would you want to find out that they want ninjas? Monday morning while you're up in front of them giving them the lesson? Or maybe the weekend before? Or maybe a week before, so that you could look around and you could say, oh, kamikaze pilots are very ninja-like. I'm going to make sure we have some information and some stuff on kamikaze pilots. Or what about those long fighting swords and their short stabbing swords and those submarines that were really small? And we'll talk about a country had a very different way of fighting, very ninja-like. And now I've honored what my students wanted. So we can never anticipate, or if you can, you're lucky, but most of the time grown-ups cannot anticipate what's engaging to their students. So as long as we're doing a pre-assessment to adjust the lesson, let's not forget the engagement part too. So it's simple. What do you know? What don't you know? What do you want to know? Those are the 3 questions. Pre-test and post-test. If we give a short test before the lesson, and then we give maybe even the same test after the lesson, wouldn't that be a nice way to show value added, or the effectiveness of the teacher, or the effectiveness of the lesson? And wouldn't it be nice to show, if we had below grade level questions on this test, it might even show that even though our kids had not reached proficiency yet, I was able to move students who were a grade or 2 below. At least I moved them up from the 1st grade level to the 2nd grade level because I've included those kinds of questions on my test. So the beauty of the pretest we're talking about here is they have a low enough floor where you're not going to get that 0. You will actually be able to find where a kid is at, and then you can get credit for where you move him. And also what happens is the kid gets credit and gets feedback about moving. He may say, you know what, I'm not proficient yet on this skill, but look where I was when I started. I was at the first grade level. Now I'm at the second grade level, or I've moved to the third grade level. I'm moving. And again, it gives a student a sense of accomplishment. So we could do this. We could put down pre-test scores and then put down your post-test scores, and you could show improvement. If it were up to me, this is the way I would do teacher evaluations. I would pick some priority skills or some bad new skills over the course of the year, ask a teacher to pick 2, 3, maybe 4, and say, do a pre-test. Let me see how you adjusted the lesson based on data, and then tell me how that lesson worked and what you're going to do about the fact that you still have some casualties. To me, that would be a way to evaluate teachers. Pretests also help us to differentiate. For example, a student who demonstrates mastery of a geometry skill that I'm about to teach, he might have the opportunity to compact out of the traditional sequence, while other students learn the grade level geometry skill. Some students that scored low on the pretest, they would be provided skill building or prerequisite activities to reach the necessary readiness level. I noticed one of you asked about, could you include an advanced question on the pretest? And the answer is yes, you could. What we've done is, if students get the grade level questions correct, we assume advanced, but I like your answer better. Why assume when we need to know exactly where they're at? Because again, we may not be building an advanced section that's appropriate for them. So yeah, so you could add an advanced question also. So if it was a 4th grade test, you could do 2 4th grade standards, a 3rd grade standard, and maybe you could add a 5th grade standard question to check for the advanced. Here's the main thing. If you provide good data, you give me good pretest data, and you have good teachers, you'll wind up with good instruction. For example, if you're teaching a 9th grade geography lesson on weather stations and I discover that some of my kids don't understand longitude and latitude a week ahead of time, won't most of us adjust the lesson so that I can bring them up to speed? You want good people to do good things, give them good data. Good data early enough to make corrections, okay? Pretests can also provide focus and a sense of urgency to our PLCs and our teacher-based teams. Sometimes teacher-based teams that I've observed don't have a sense of focus. And what happens is, during those meetings, we begin to talk about other things. For example, bus behavior on bus number 9 or classroom lunch duty, because that has a sense of urgency to it. Well, if I'm going to meet with my teachers next week and I've just discovered that my students want ninjas in the Pearl Harbor lesson, or that my weather station lesson, my kids don't know longitude and latitude, that might be something I would want to bring up at my teacher-based team. I would want to say to my colleagues, here's the lesson I've been doing and it hasn't worked, and now I'm beginning to see why it doesn't work. Here's where my kids are at. Help me fix this. And now there's a sense of urgency at those teacher-based meetings. And that was the original intent of those meetings, to talk about improving the instruction that you're about to give. Let's try one. Let's take a look at this. Let's pretend let's do this. Here's our 4th grade math standard. This is what I want to teach. Now, in the past, I've just walked in with my lesson and I've taught this. But this time, I gave a pretest. Let's watch. Here's how I want to show you some student data, and I would like you to score it. Score it 3, 2, 1, or 0. I'll ask you to pretend you have 3 students in your class, okay? So, and I'd like you to score this data for me. So here's your first student. This is real data, by the way, real 4th grade data. You can see our test question. Heidi and James each have a bottle of juice that is the same size. Heidi drank 1/4 of her juice and James drank 1/3. Who drank more juice, and use pictures, words, or numbers to show how you know. Here's the first student response on my pretest. What was the score? You don't have to post it, but it would be good just to put it down on a piece of paper. Score this one, 3, 2, 1, or 0. All right, let's do the next one. And let's do one more, okay? This is our last student's response. So let's talk about this. I think everyone can see the workshop chat room. Do you see that the scores aren't always the same among you? So let's talk about this. First of all, one of the things that's nice about a pre-assessment, especially a pre-assessment that I share with my colleagues, is that we can begin to talk about what proficient work looks like. Look at the different scores you guys did. Now, granted, it's fast and it was just pretend, but look at, we had 2s, we had 1s. Isn't that worth a discussion? If one of you are thinking that this was well below proficient and someone says it's okay, we'd have a discussion with our colleagues so that we could crystallize exactly what proficient work looks like. To me, that's a great discussion to have in my teacher-based teams, and it's a discussion that wouldn't come up unless we were bringing this data to the table. And if you're scoring too easy, it probably means you're teaching too easy. And if you're scoring too hard, it means you're probably teaching too long and you're the one that never gets finished with the book because you're over teaching. A conversation, a data-driven conversation like this would have us agreeing about what proficient work looks like. Here's something else. We would look at, and what I'd like you to think about now is the student who was proficient did or knew what? And the students that were not proficient, what is it that they didn't know? What is it that they didn't do? Or what is it that they did wrong? We could have a discussion and begin to tweeze this out because this will help us design a lesson at the correct starting point for the kids we have. So we'd analyze that pre-assessment and begin to make adjustments to our lesson. And then finally, develop the lesson that they need. And would I teach as a whole group? Would I break people into workstations? Again, we're back to good data will allow good people to do good things. Here's the lesson in white is the original lesson we were going to give to those fourth graders. It was fractions at the fair. Once we did our pre-assessment and seen the data came back and seen how low some students were and that there was a misconception about whole numbers and fractions, they thought 4 was bigger than 3, which works in the world of whole numbers, but not in the world of fractions almost all the time. We had to make some adjustments to our lesson. We started those adjustments. Remember, this is fourth grade. We started the adjustments by bringing in, we talked with a kindergarten teacher who talked to us about the book called Gator Pie, which is about the alligator that makes the birthday cake out of a mud pie, and he cuts it into pieces, 4. But then as more of his friends come, he cuts it into more pieces, but each piece becomes smaller. And it's balancing those two ideas. That's what fractions are all about. We also used a poem by Shel Silverstein. Remember the poem? My dad gave me $1. I traded it for 2/4 because 2 is more than 1. And then finally, for some students, we had to have a separate lesson. We used fraction land flags where we had them fold papers into thirds and halves and talk about which pieces were bigger, even though the number was smaller. So we adjusted the lesson. The problem was the year before, I didn't make these adjustments. I taught the lesson in white, not because I'm a bad guy, because I didn't know any better. I didn't know what my students didn't know. And that's why my number sense scores were low. So this is the fix. The biggest speed bump people run into as they try this system where they take formative assessment and move it in front of the lesson is developing the questions. One of the good things, whether you like Common Core or not, and I understand both sides of that argument, one of the good things about Common Core is that companies are now investing a lot of money into the Common Core because now they can sell that product to all the states. And so we are very close to seeing huge item banks come out around the Common Core. Right now, Hawaii is taking item banks from across the country and linking them to the Common Core, the Department of Education in Hawaii. So you can always look for state practice items, but again, remember the key. You would look for state practice items at grades 4, but then also the grade 3 prerequisite skill and maybe grade 2, and like someone said, maybe the advanced one, grade 5. So you'd have to have multiple grade questions in front of you. Other products I've looked at is, I like one by Edmodo. A lot of our teachers have used Edmodo on their computer or their tablets or their phones to talk to each other and look at lessons. Edmodo has now developed Snapshot, which is a data-based item, is an item bank. And teachers can develop tests using Snapshot. The other product I've looked at is, and they're using it a lot in Ohio, is Procore. And I've just worked with one of the districts that I was assigned to by the State Department because their student achievement was low. They rave about Procore and they've jumped. They were the lowest scoring district in the state of Ohio. They did a great job, by the way, with their big tests. They just weren't very balanced as far as formative assessment. They added the Procore small test to their program, and within 1 year they jumped 75 school districts. Now remember, this was the lowest performing district in the state of Ohio. That's why I had to go there. And they made this jump of 75 districts by balancing their assessments. That's it. So the theme of today is a balance of big tests and little tests. And if you're using formative assessment, let's start paying more attention to it. Thinking about when it is we give it, what it should be. I notice when we talk about big tests, we can be very specific in terms of dates and binders and companies and money and all this stuff. As soon as I talk to people and ask about formative assessment, the responses get a little bit more murky and a little bit vague. Well, yeah, we do it. What, could I see one? Do you discuss them in your teacher-based teams? Are all the third grade teachers doing them? Do you do formative assessment around your weak strands more than you do your strengths, or is it all the time? What do you do with that data? Does it impact your lesson? How do you change your lesson after day 2 or 3? I notice it becomes a little loosey-goosey when we talk about formative assessment. So what I'm asking for is if we could now switch our attention and let's get as organized and smart about our little tests as we are about our big tests. If you guys are okay, I see Kelsey's question. Kelsey asked, and I'm always forgetting whether you guys can see the workshop chat thing. Kelsey says, how do you balance student interest with the need to cover the standards? Uh, let's do this two ways. First of all, what we've seen is student interest will go up in two ways using this technique. First of all, because I've asked them what they want us to do. And so that one question is, it's serious. What do you want to know? And incorporating that into the lesson, that helps with interest. But here's the more important one. When you have the right lesson, which allows all kids access, even if it's at a grade lower, if you're doing stuff that kids can do, they're more interested too. Oftentimes what happens, if I've got a kid who is missing some prerequisite skills, so let's say it this way, I'm teaching a 5th grade standard and I've got some kids who are at 3rd grade standard, some kids who are at the 2nd grade standard, some kids who are at the 4th grade standard. All those kids, which could be what? 15%, 20%, some of you would say it's 60% of your class. I'm up there wondering if they're getting it. They're up back there wondering, why are we doing this? And I don't even know what you guys are talking about. How long would you sit through a lesson that was, I mean, come on, we've all been in that class, haven't we, in college? I have no idea what these guys are talking about. It's painful. And so then what we do is we check out. And so again, there's two ways to keep students' interest. One is just ask them, but the other one is to have a lesson that they can access, not just access, but also access and show improvement in. It's a big deal for me that when we do that pretest to also do a post-test and to keep those grade level and grade below level questions on that pretest. And I am quick to point out to kids who maybe aren't proficient yet, but I'm quick to point out to them, but look how much better you got. When you pay attention and sit up in front and don't worry about passing notes, but worry about passing the class, do you see how much better you got? Now, we're not done yet, Bruce. We've got some more work to do to get you to grade level, but look how far we came. You keep working and I'll keep working. So I think a lot of kids, I don't think we have an academic gap in our country. I think we've got an engagement gap in our country. Some kids just don't think they can do it, so they got a choice. The standards are stupid and you're stupid, or they are. And guess what? They pick you because they can't win. How long would you play a game you can't win? And that's what happens. Yes, thanks. You're right, Jason. When students see an increase in understanding and achievement, motivation levels, interest level increase. That's true. They're in the game.